Chapters 55 to 59 of Tristram Shandy, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, Gentleman, Volume 3, by Laurence Sterne. Chapter 55. When my uncle Toby had turned everything into money, and settled all accounts betwixt the agent of the regiment and Lefevre, and betwixt Lefevre and all mankind, there remained nothing more in my uncle Toby's hands than an old regimental coat and a sword, so that my uncle Toby found little or no opposition from the world in taking administration. The coat my uncle Toby gave the corporal. "Wear it, Trim," said my uncle Toby, "as long as it will hold together, for the sake of the poor lieutenant. And this," said my uncle Toby, taking up the sword in his hand and drawing it out of the scabbard as he spoke, "and this, Lefevre, I'll save for thee. 'Tis all the fortune," continued my uncle Toby, hanging it up upon a crook and pointing to it, "'tis all the fortune, my dear Lefevre, which God has left thee. But if he has given thee a heart to fight thy way with it in the world, and thou dost it like a man of honour, 'tis enough for us." As soon as my uncle Toby had laid a foundation, and taught him to inscribe a regular polygon in a circle, he sent him to a public school, where, excepting Whitsuntide and Christmas, at which times the corporal was punctually dispatched for him, he remained to the spring of the year 17. When the stories of the Emperor's sending his army into Hungary against the Turks, kindling a spark of fire in his bosom, he left his Greek and Latin without leave, and throwing himself upon his knees before my uncle Toby, begged his father's sword, and my uncle Toby's leave along with it, to go and try his fortune under Eugene. Twice did my uncle Toby forget his wound and cry out, "Lefevre, I will go with thee, and thou shalt fight beside me." And twice he lay his hand upon his groin, and hung down his head in sorrow and disconsolation. My uncle Toby took down the sword from the crook, where it had hung untouched ever since the lieutenant's death, and delivered it to the corporal to brighten him up. And having detained Lefevre a single fortnight to equip him, and contract for his passage to Leghorn, he put the sword into his hand. "If thou art brave, Lefevre," said my uncle Toby, "this will not fail thee. But fortune," said he, musing a little, "fortune may, and if she does," added my uncle Toby, embracing him, "come back again to me, Lefevre, and we will shape thee another course." The greatest injury could not have oppressed the heart of Lefevre more than my uncle Toby's paternal kindness. He parted from my uncle Toby as the best of sons from the best of fathers. Both dropped tears, and as my uncle Toby gave him his last kiss, he slipped 60 guineas, tied up in an old purse of his father's, in which was his mother's ring, into his hand, and bid God bless him. Chapter 56. Lefevre got up to the imperial army just time enough to try what metal his sword was made of, at the defeat of the Turks before Belgrade. But a series of unmerited mischances had pursued him from that moment, and trod close upon his heels for 4 years together after. He had withstood these buffetings to the last, till sickness overtook him at Marseilles, from whence he wrote my uncle Toby word. He had lost his time, his service, his health, and in short, everything but his sword, and was waiting for the first ship to return back to him. As this letter came to hand about 6 weeks before Susanna's accident, Lefevre was hourly expected, and was uppermost in my uncle Toby's mind all the time my father was giving him and Yorick a description of what kind of person he would choose for a preceptor to me. But as my uncle Toby thought my father at first somewhat fanciful in the accomplishments he required, he forbore mentioning Lefevre's name, till the character by Yorick's interposition ending unexpectedly in one who should be gentle-tempered and generous and good, it impressed the image of Lefevre and his interest upon my Uncle Toby so forcibly, he rose instantly off his chair, and laying down his pipe in order to take hold of both my father's hands, "I beg, brother Shandy," said my Uncle Toby, "I may recommend poor Lefevre's son to you." "I beseech you do," added Yorick. "He has a good heart," said my Uncle Toby, "and a brave one too." "And please your honour," said the corporal. "The best hearts, Trim, are ever the bravest," replied my Uncle Toby, "and the greatest cowards, and please your honour, in our regiment, were the greatest rascals in it. There was Sergeant Cumber and Ensign— we'll talk about them," my father said, "another time." Chapter 57. What a jovial and merry world this would be, may it please your worships, but for that inextricable labyrinth of debts, cares, woes, want, grief, discontent, melancholy, large jointures, impositions, and lies. Dr. Slop, like a son of as my father called him for it, to exalt himself, debased me to death, and made 10,000 times more of Susanna's accident than there were any grounds for, so that in a week's time or less it was in everybody's mouth. That poor Master Shandy, entirely, and Fame, who loves to double everything, in 3 days more had sworn positively she saw it, and all the world, as usual, gave credit to her evidence, that the nursery window had not only, but that also— Could the world have been sued like a body corporate? My father had brought an action upon the case, and trounced it sufficiently, but to fall foul of individuals about it, as every soul who had mentioned the affair did it with the greatest pity imaginable. 'Twas like flying in the very face of his best friends, and yet to acquiesce under the report in silence was to acknowledge it openly, at least in the opinion of one half of the world, and to make a bustle again in contradicting it was to confirm it as strongly in the opinion of the other half. "Was ever poor devil of a country gentleman so hampered?" said my father. "I would show him publicly," said my Uncle Toby, "at the market cross." "'Twill have no effect," said my father. Chapter 58. "I'll put him, however, into breeches," said my father. "Let the world say what it will." Chapter 59. There are 1,000 resolutions, sir, both in church and state, as well as in matters, madam, of a more private concern, which, though they have carried all the appearance in the world of being taken and entered upon in a hasty, harebrained, and unadvised manner, were, notwithstanding this, and could you or I have got into the cabinet or stood behind the curtain, we should have found it was so, weighed, poised, and perpended, argued upon, canvassed through, entered into, and examined on all sides with so much coolness, that the goddess of coolness herself, I do not take it upon me to prove her existence, could neither have wished it nor done it better. Of the number of these was my father's resolution of putting me into breeches, which, though determined at once, in a kind of huff, and a defiance of all mankind, had, nevertheless, been proed and conned, and judiciously talked over betwixt him and my mother about a month before, in 2 several beds of justice, which my father held for that purpose. I shall explain the nature of these beds of justice in my next chapter, and in the chapter following that you shall step with me, madam, behind the curtain, only to hear in what kind of manner my father and my mother debated between themselves this affair of the breeches, from which you may form an idea how they debated all lesser matters. End of chapters 55 to 59.